I'm joined once again by international relations expert Philippe Assouline. Philippe, we now know that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has formed a coalition government involving some religious right elements. This is like the slimmest of majorities, 61 out of the 120 member parliament. So let's start at the very beginning. This is not, even with the coalition, certainly no mandate. Do we agree?
Yes, I mean, I personally wasn't very happy with this coalition at all. A lot of Israelis aren't happy. It's the narrowest of margins, as you've said, so it's probably going to be paralyzed. And there are conflicting parts within the coalition. So it's going to be very interesting looking forward. This is one of these moments where democracy, doesn't satisfy a lot of people, and you just have to take it and roll with the punches.
Do you think that from someone who is looking at the situation in Israel as one where the primary goal should be, let's do whatever we can to get closer, maybe not to, but closer to restarting sensible and productive long-term peace talks, is this a coalition in your mind that is going to get us closer, get us further away, or maybe simply because of the paralysis that you suggest will happen, we'll do neither of the two?
Unfortunately, I have to tell you, it's all of them. On the one hand, the negotiations don't entirely depend on Netanyahu or his coalition, right? There's Abbas in the picture, and Abbas has a different set of incentives and interests. Regarding the Palestinians strictly, this is a coalition that foreshadows a lot of paralysis, a lot of backtracking, a lot of obfuscation, and probably not much progress. Fundamentally, though, the different situation now is that the Arab world is interested in peace with Israel because of the Iran situation. And Netanyahu has seemed to be friendly to that. And so that could be very promising, a kind of bypassing Abbas and going back to almost the 1970s kind of peacemaking with the Arab League in its entirety. And that would be, in my opinion, a wonderful track to pursue. Difficult, but much more stable, and probably one that would garner a lot of Israelis' trust more than Abbas, who has in the past rejected peace offers, made statements praising terrorism, etc. Things that have inflamed the divisions.
Do you see that Abbas might be one of many potential partners on the Palestinian side to have conversations with? Or do you see Abbas as sort of the lone potential influencer on that side that might be part of some productive peace talks? Because I talk to people who say Abbas is the only guy and you're just not going to be able to have productive conversations with any other factions of Palestinians. Or others say Abbas's involvement could catalyze other Palestinian groups to want to talk.
I think that's too restrictive when they say only Abbas. Abbas has proven to be somebody who's somewhat paralyzed. He doesn't control Gaza because Hamas does, and they certainly won't sit down with the Israelis. In the West Bank, he controls, an old elite, but there's a lot of people who resent him for the corruption and for the stagnation. And his own interest might be not to strike a deal, right? That's why he's going for all these ceremonial recognitions, because if he strikes a deal, he might be threatened by Hamas the next day. That said, one of the most encouraging and inspiring things I've seen come out of the Arab Spring is all these Arab dissidents, politicians, activists who are willing to speak up now that they weren't before. And there's a number of voices coming from the Palestinian community who come from there, unlike Abbas, who was in exile for decades, and who are willing to speak a language that the Israelis can understand. They're more concerned with actually what their people need more than symbolic achievements. People like Bassam Aid, a human rights activist who has been critical of the Israelis, but also of the Palestinians. There's more and more of these voices, and I would be thrilled were these people to be given a voice. The Oslo process in 1993 chose to empower Yasser Arafat, who, in point of fact, is not really Palestinian, was not really Palestinian. He had a Palestinian family, but he grew up in Egypt and was appointed by Arab governments. And there was a lot of questions about that. Should we not empower local leaders who actually know the people and know the Israelis? There might be a chance for that now. But with this coalition, is there going to be that kind of vision? I don't know.
Before we get back to a few more specific questions about the coalition I want to address, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, in a hypothetical scenario where Abbas does say, I'm in, I want to have serious discussions here, let's do something. Do you feel, based on the research you've done and everything all the people you've been talking to, that would be received negatively by Hamas in Gaza, because they would say, oh, Abbas is actually not sticking to what we see as the right path forward? Or do you think that they may be swayed in some kind of pragmatic wave to say, okay, maybe we not necessarily sit down and talk, as you said is not likely to happen, but we should reconsider some elements of what our doctrine is?
Reconsidering the doctrine, I don't think so. Hamas exists on this vehement ideological opposition to Zionism and, in fact, to Jews. It's a very anti-Semitic group. However, you can play with the incentives they have. In the past, when the PLO and Fatah have become closer to Israel and Hamas has been sidelined, they've used violence to get back on our TV screens. But they are dependent on money coming in from Qatar, on support from Turkey, on the tunnels from Egypt. There's a way to, pardon the expression, but choke them financially so that they might be more docile. On the other hand, a wounded animal is something that's very dangerous. So it's very hard to tell with Hamas. Even within Hamas, there's different factions. And Gaza happens to be half of the equation here. So it's like you have to walk on eggshells and you have to do a very tricky balancing act. But ideologically, if Hamas accepts the existence of Israel in principle, not as a hudna, not as a temporary thing so they can rearm, if they accept it on principle, like Fatah is said to have done, then they cease to exist as Hamas. And I don't see them being able to do that or even willing to do that.
So let's talk now about the coalition that Benjamin Netanyahu has formed. You talked about how there are a number of elements to it, and of course it's Likud plus 4 other parties. Of the 4 other parties, which elements do you think are the most concerning with regard to their sort of extremist religious positioning within the conversation around peace?
Okay, so within the conversation around peace is one thing and religious extremism is another. The more hard right in terms of uncompromising vis-a-vis the Palestinians may actually be in Netanyahu's own Likud party. The religious Zionist party of Naftali Bennett, Jewish Home, also has obviously a lot of support from the settlers, but he at least has come up with a plan for autonomy for the Palestinians, which some people in Likud don't even have that. And those two, the right flank of the Likud and that party, are obviously going to be the biggest impediment to an Oslo-type deal, which I have to say there's very little appetite for in Israel now, given the terrorism that ensued. There's a kind of a resignation that peace is a farce that we play. It's a play we put on for the Americans, and the Palestinians feel the same way because the deep ideological underpinnings on either side don't feel like they've been addressed. There's another set of religious parties which to me are a bigger danger to Israel in the long term, and that's the ultra-Orthodox parties, because they represent a group of a part of the population that is not working, that is not active in the economy, that doesn't serve in the army, and so is growing and developing somewhat aside from the mainstream, and in obviously, like all religious populations, moving towards a more rigid position. And that, for me, is a threat to Israel's very fabric in the future.
Last thing I want to touch on is, does this particular coalition, in terms of what it represents inherently, have an impact on how it may work with other countries that are part of the discussion? We know, of course, that the United States has a role and has had a role with regard to Israeli-Palestinian relations for a long time. Does the makeup of this current coalition change at all what the relationship is or may be with the United States?
Well, as you've seen, it started off on a bit of a confrontational footing on the one hand. On the other, it's the right wing in Israel that often ends up making peace because it's put on the defensive, because it has the security, gravitas, and authority to make compromises. So it'll be hard to see. The minister in charge of negotiation with the Palestinians was the foreign minister under Ariel Sharon during the disengagement from Gaza. So he has experience. He probably would work well with the Americans. But it remains to be seen. There's a big problem of personality between Obama and Netanyahu. Regarding other countries, there's a lot of right-wing governments that are being elected everywhere in the world. So there might actually be some kind of more fluid discussion there and the possibility of pressuring them. I don't see anything happening in any sphere because of the small size of this coalition.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line, and I'll give you the last word on it, is that on balance, making all the considerations on the one hand, on the other hand, but this, but that, I just am not optimistic that there's going to be any real progress on peace under this current coalition.
Probably not. And again, it's not entirely in their hands. Abbas holds half the cards here, and he seems to be paralyzed by his own political considerations. And he's getting a lot of support for that position from the international community. He's getting recognition of a state that he's not really building. So on the one hand, you have Israel that has a very narrow right-wing coalition. It's going to be paralyzed just by that concern. Netanyahu is very averse to risking power. On the other hand, you have Abbas, who is happy collecting the trappings of a state without really engaging on a deeper level. So I don't think we should expect anything great, with the exception possibly, and I personally hope so, of negotiations with the Arab League itself.
All right. Well, not necessarily the most optimistic outcome from our conversation, but at least realistic, if nothing else. And there's certainly something to be said for that. We've been speaking with international relations expert Philippe Assouline. Philippe, a pleasure as always to have you on.
Thank you, David, for having me.